St. James Episcopal Church is a perfect example of outstanding architecture in a small structure. It was designed by one of the greatest architects of the 19th century. The style is Gothic Revival, and that's a reprise of an architectural style from the medieval age, the style we now call Gothic. Now, the term Gothic is probably the biggest misnomer in all of architecture. The look has absolutely nothing to do with anything Gothic. It has everything to do with the French. In the medieval era, from 1200 to 1500, what we now know as Gothic architecture was developed. It should actually be called the French style because it became a staple throughout the great cathedrals in France and then spread throughout Europe. The most obvious style element of that era was the pointed arch. The pointed arch was a matter of function that allowed builders to scale new heights. With this pointed arch, ceilings could now be built thinner, and they didn't require those pesky support posts. The weight of the ceiling was supported by those arched ribs, and it allowed for greater height, and as an added bonus, those arches pointed to the very heavens. Perfect for the church. A buttress was another style element that was a matter of function. A buttress provided support to prevent stone walls from falling outward. Notice the buttress here on St. James, and here, and here. These buttresses are attached directly to the wall, and they are added to keep the stone walls from falling out. The big churches in France also used buttresses, but their medieval-style buttress looked more like this. Notice the buttress supports at the top, but then they fly away from the wall and attach then to the ground. This was called a flying buttress. Another design element from those medieval churches: gargoyles. Gargoyles were grotesque figures carved from stone, figures that were placed high atop the outside walls of medieval churches. These sinister-looking characters' inclusion on medieval churches is a bit of a mystery. We do know that some members of the clergy spoke out against using these images on the church. Some of these figures were merely decorative, but most had a very important function. So the church in France adopted this look with the pointed arches, flying buttress, and gargoyles, and it spread throughout Europe. It was a French style. So how did we end up with the word Gothic? Enter the Renaissance boys. The Renaissance was a cultural movement that spread throughout Europe in the 1600s, with the rebirth of learning in art, science, and architecture. Alberti, Christopher Wren, and Brunelleschi were Renaissance architects that replaced the pointed arch look with their more genteel, perfect arch. The Renaissance boys viewed their style as far superior to the medieval era, so they began disparaging the old style as more than just passé. They called it downright barbaric. The Renaissance boys knew that negative advertising works, so they tagged the old French style with the biggest insult they could possibly muster. The Goths were a barbaric band of raging conquerors, savages, uncouth, bad-smelling brutes. The Renaissance boys knew that negative advertising worked, so they began calling the French style Gothic. The Goths had nothing to do whatsoever with what we call Gothic architecture today. But the Renaissance boys' insult stuck, and that is why one of the most elegant looks in architecture today has a most inelegant name: Gothic. Gothic revival became popular in the 1800s, and its rise in popularity can be directly tied to this man, Richard Upjohn. Upjohn was the first president of the American Institute of Architects in 1857, and he designed many buildings on a grand scale. Now, as he traveled throughout small-town America, he lamented the dearth of proper Episcopal churches. Upjohn, you see, considered himself Christian first, architect second, and he had a genuine desire to improve the quality of the Episcopal Church. So, he published a plan book in 1852. Small parishes like this one could now afford the service of a professional architect, all for the cost of a book. Richard Upjohn's rural architecture details the exact size and how many of each timber were needed, how the joists were to be laid, how the doors should be constructed, right down to the paint or varnish that was to be used. The book also included patterns for every piece of interior furniture, right down to the trefoil tops on the pews. Gothic revival elements of this beautiful building include the pointed arches over the doors and windows and the buttresses. There are no gargoyles, but there is a small bell tower atop the building called a bell cote. The members of the Episcopal Church here are very friendly to visitors, so if you see someone inside or around the church, ask if they have a moment to show you the interior. Inside the church, the stained glass windows vary greatly, reflecting the different periods in which they were installed. Now, in the front, too, there are 3 lance windows. The lance, like the sword of the Spirit. Notice there are 3 windows for Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. One of the best examples you'll ever find of excellent architecture in a small structure is this: St. James Episcopal Church.